Hi everybody, my name is Jens Larsen. You're probably already coming up with jazz lines, spelling out the harmony using chord tones and chromatic passing notes, and they still don't really sound really like great lines when you play them. The problem is probably in the phrasing, and in this video I'm going to talk about how you can recognize what the problem is, how you can make some lines that are easier to phrase so that they sound like great jazz lines. And I'm also going to take a small part of a George Benson solo and demonstrate how he gets it right. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar, get better at improvising, and check out some interesting arpeggios and scale sounds, then subscribe to my channel. If you want to make sure not to miss anything, then click the little bell notification icon next to the subscribe button. The first thing is probably to be able to recognize the problem. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to play two jazz lines, and then I'm going to talk about why the second one sounds better than the first one. Both of these phrases are good in the sense that they use the chord tones, they spell out the harmony, and they're pointing towards an important note in the next chord all the time, so there's a logical movement in the melody. But with the first one, the way the melody flows, we have a tendency to want to emphasize the heavy beats all the time. So we're moving from 1 to 3, and those are the notes that are going to get the accent. And this has to do with how the melody is constructed. So really what we have with the first one is, and that's not really gonna give us great phrasing, because if you listen to bebop phrases, they have to have some more surprising twists and turns, and that's really a big part of what is going on within an 8-note line in that style. The second phrase has a flow that's a lot better, and that has to do with the fact that there are some high notes within the line that are off the beat, and we can give those some accents, and that's what's really going to make it a great bebop or hard bop line. So if we look at the first example on the D minor 7, that's an F major triad, and the way I played it is like, so I have this C on the 2 and that goes down to a B on the 3, so we can give that an accent. So, and the same thing happens in the next part of the line, so then it's an ascending B diminished arpeggio, and on the 4 end we have the high A flat resolving down to a G on the C major 7, so that gives an accent as well. So we have, and then on the A7 I'm skipping up on the 3 end, so to the high B flat here on the flat 9, and that gets an accent as well. What we're looking for is a way to introduce these high notes that are not on the beat that we can give an accent, and that's gonna make the line sound a lot better. And you kind of have to incorporate that into your playing while you're making lines. So this has to be a part of how you come up with lines. Of course, you don't have time to think about stuff like this when you're soloing, but you can work on getting it into your playing by practicing composing lines and coming up with lines, and check if they actually sound good and if it's possible to phrase them in a nice way. And it's not that difficult, because we have two heavy beats in the bar. We have the 1 and we have the 3. And then we actually only have two different types of offbeats, because we have the one that's before a heavy beat, so we have on the 2 and on the 4 and, or we have the ones that are right after a heavy beat, and that would be the 1 and the 3 and. So if we just start with the ones that's before a heavy beat, now if I take the progression from D minor to G7, if I play a D minor 7 arpeggio, so at the end of this arpeggio I need to move down, because then I can accent the last note in the arpeggio. And that's really easy because this naturally wants to move down to a B anyway. So already doing this, you have a phrase where you can add an accent. If we do the same with the arpeggio from the 3rd, so the F major 7. So here I'm resolving down to the 5th of the G7. And of course you could do the same and then resolve it to a flat 13 if it's an alto dominant, so something like this. The example that I used in the beginning on the D minor 7 was the F major triad, and of course that works as well. So if I play the F major triad and then have the C as the last note, so then I can accent that because it's moving down to a B. A pentatonic scale run, like this D minor pentatonic scale run. So the A is the last note on the 2 and the way you're going to be able to accent that is that if you move down on the first note on the G7 So a logical candidate would be to go down to a flat 9, so the A flat, and then we can accent the A. The other type of high note that we have is the one that's right after a heavy beat, so that would be the 1 and the 3 and. And if I use G7 to C major to demonstrate this, if I'm coming out on a B on the G7, I need to have a note on the 1 and that's higher than that one. So an easy candidate to do that would be to just go up the arpeggio and then go from the 3rd up to the 5th. So, and then maybe use that as a sort of diminished arpeggio. So that's giving me a place where I can just put an accent on this D. Another one would be to take more of like a scale approach to it. So if I come out on the B flat here, so G7 altered, and then I just go 1 up on the scale and then make a descending scale run. So, and then naturally I can emphasize the B here on the 1 end. And if you have a phrase that's descending, so we come out on the B like this, and then the rest of the phrase is just a descending movement. So in this case, for instance, a scale run in harmonic minor, so B, A flat, G, F, then we can actually also add an accent to the A flat, because that's going to be higher than the notes that follow, and that is enough for us to give it an accent, like this. So this is a complete line, just showing how you can add these things together and use the 2 different approaches to add some accents. And here I'm using the first one, so D minor line is first just an F major 7 arpeggio ascending, and then I can accent the E because the next note, which is the note on the 3, is a D. So, and the technique that I'm using for this is really where technique becomes part of your phrasing also. So what I'm doing here is I'm making a pull off from E to D, because that's naturally going to make the E a little bit louder than the D and give that an accent. So, and here on the G7 I'm using the high D, so, and the same thing actually happens when I go to the G7 altered in the second half of that bar. First the B flat and then the B. So again using the pull off and adding the accent on the B here, and then resolving that to the G on the C major 7. Here I'm using an inversion of the F major 7, so I'm starting on this F and then I'm going down, skipping down to the low A, and then again I have the E resolving to the D that I can accent, then running down the D minor 7 arpeggio, and then on the G7 first G augmented triad, and because the G is higher than the F, I can give that an accent. So, and the same kind of happens when I go from the E flat down to the D on the C major 7. The accents are telling us that the line is changing direction, and to keep it interesting, a little bit more surprising to the listener, we want to do that not on the heavy beats where you expect it, but on the off beats, and then we're just really going to point it out by adding an accent to the highest note where it's going to change direction. You can use these examples and these exercises to learn how to hear where the accents are supposed to be and how you insert them into your own playing. And of course, that's only one way you can do it. Another thing that's really useful to do is to start to check out people with really great phrasing and then figure out how they do it and try to copy that, and also just by really listening to it and checking it out, getting it into your playing in that way. A really great example of some very solid jazz phrasing is of course George Benson. And in this video I'm going to take 4 bars out of his solo from Billy's Bounce and use that to illustrate how he uses these types of accents and this type of playing to really get some great lines. It's easier to hear what's going on if we slow down the solo a bit, so here it is at 80% of the speed. Billy's Bounce is a blues in F, and I'm coming in at the end of the chorus, so on the cadence to the 2 chord, so A minor, D7 to G minor. The first phrase is a sweep of a C major triad and then sliding down to an F sharp. That doesn't really have any accents, so mostly that probably has to do with the fact that it's a sweep, so it's kind of difficult to really add an accent. The next part of the phrase does actually contain an accent because Then George Benson is skipping up to a high D and going just down a scale one, so D, C to the B flat on the one of the G minor chord. And here we can accent the C. So that gets an accent. The next part of the phrase is a chromatic enclosure of the G, and that starts on the 2, so we have F sharp and then an A on the 2 end that resolves down to a G. So that gets an accent as well. The next part of this phrase doesn't really have any sort of accents in there. And then we're on the C7 on the 1 with the E. And here the second note gets an accent on the one end, so that's it's skipping up to a G. And then skipping down to a C with this sort of bebop cliche. And then ends on this D. And because the D is the last note, it kind of naturally gets an accent. And also it's on the 3 end. The next part is the turnaround of this chorus, and the first part of that is just really on the beat, all of it. So that doesn't really get any accents in itself. Then we get a blues phrase with a leading note up to the 3rd, and here the 3rd actually gets an accent. And then rounding it off with this syncopated rhythm where the G kind of gets an accent. I think this is a great example of how George Benson is using the idea of just changing direction and adding a lot of skips to his lines, and that makes it more interesting to listen to and more surprising. So imagine that instead of playing he would have done something that would have gone in one direction, then that would have been, which is a lot less interesting to listen to. I'm pretty sure that George Benson doesn't take apart his own solos in the way that we're doing it in this video, but at the same time, if you look at it like that and if you understand how it works and work with the exercises and the examples that I went over in the beginning of this video, then that's going to help you get better at recognizing and hearing what is going on, and it's also going to help you make better lines where it's possible to add these accents, because if you're not thinking about it, then you might just be making lines where you cannot add any accents at all, and those are probably not going to make for really interesting solos. I'm of course really curious what you're working on when you're trying to improve your phrasing. So if you have an exercise or a solo that you checked out, or maybe a player that you think, well, this is really great phrasing, you need to check this out, then leave a comment on this video. I'm certainly curious, and I'm sure that other people watching the video are interested as well. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar and this is the first time you see one of my videos, then subscribe to my channel. The videos I publish on this channel are all about finding solid methods and good strategies to improve as a guitar player, and I've been doing this for quite some time, so there's already a lot of material on my channel. If you want to help me keep making videos, then check out my Patreon page. I'm very grateful for the support that I'm getting from my patrons, and that's what makes it possible for me to keep on going with making videos every week. If you join me on Patreon, you can also join the Facebook group that we have of the patrons, and of course I can give you something in return for your support. That's about it for this week. Thank you for watching, and until next week.